Hello and welcome to the Futurist Letters show. My name is Cairo Smith. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Futurist Letters, the journal. I am also the host of the Futurist Letters show. I am here with my stalwart co-host, Kenny White. Hey, Kenny.
Hey, what's up, Cairo?
It's nice to be back at it with our first fall episode. We keep it beachy here, but it's still going to be a little autumnal in spirit, I think. And best fall wishes to you, listener, wherever you are. If you want to sponsor the show, as you know, this is where your sponsor message will go. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Substack. You can find us at futuristletters.com. And you can listen to the audio on Spotify, or you can add us through RSS on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast app you like. Today we don't have a guest. It's just myself and Kenny, and we are talking about the second half of Lee Kuan Yew's very lengthy memoir slash instruction manual, which he kind of calls not an instruction manual, about city-state building from third world to first. This is about Singapore from 1965 to 2000, roughly. Yes, Kenny and I both finished this book recently, and we talked about the first half. If you go and check out our past episodes, you can find the episode called Singapore Pilled. And in this one, we are going to be wrapping that up and then also getting into some other general literary discussion. With that, I'll say, Kenny, what were your thoughts getting to the end of this hefty tome?
A few things really struck me at the end. One thing in particular is how seriously he took succession and how seriously he took it from an early time period, and how he very intentionally tried to recruit talent, groom that talent, and grow it into their successors, while also they're gently and sometimes less so, not so gently, getting rid of the old guard to make way for the new guard. And I also found like it was really interesting to contrast that to how, well, you look at, say, the United States government leadership, especially in Congress, and it's kind of a gerontocracy where you have people just clinging to life in the Senate and in the House. And it's just, it's almost like no wonder why Singapore has done so well.
Yeah, I think about, when people say this gerontocracy thing about the United States, because obviously you read something like this book and you're comparing it to your own country, as I said a little bit the first time we talked about this. And I think, America like has a very neoclassical constitution filtered through this sort of mm, Enlightenment libertarian lens. And, like the Senate, Senatus, like it's literally a bunch of old men, like etymologically, ideologically, that's the point. like, and it makes me wonder, just by biological constraints, in the time of Rome, and, even earlier biblical times, for a lot of human history, you had this sort of three score and ten, as he says at the end, three score and ten is this good life, 70 years, right? If like constraints of medicine at that time meant that an old man is still in his cognitive prime, or at least cognitively sufficient, and that if life extension has sort of created this Pandora's box where you no longer should be trying to get the oldest possible people into your government because the mind is failing before the body. Do you think that that's fair, or is that
Yeah,
maybe an oversimplification?
I think that's basically what's happened, where we've historically, like, once you get to like the ripe old age of 60, there's a pretty high mortality rate from there on out. But but like you interact with like people at that age bracket, they seem totally competent and fine. It's just as you get older and older, yeah, cognition not true in every case, but tends to get less efficient, you could say.
Yeah.
it feels like medical technology now has gotten to the point where really, really good at like keeping you alive at all costs, emphasis on costs, um, but not necessarily keeping you healthy and sharp. So now and I think the way that power works, not just in like US politics, but just in many societies, in politics, outside of politics, the way power works is you tend to get more of it over time. And so once you have like sufficient seniority, it doesn't really matter how like sharp you are. It matters just how much like how much that power nexus has consolidated around you. And so you have people like Dianne Feinstein on the left, and I'm sure there's plenty of Republican examples like Mitch McConnell on the right. Yeah, where they've accrued so much power that even when they were long past like their capability of like leadership, they still have like a ton of influence in what happens.
And I think you can
And
end up in a dangerous situation even if you're trying to mask or compensate for this decline. I don't know. I often sort of apply a very amateur like psychopharmaceutical lens to world events or conflicts, you know? Like when you have a very net negative outcome like a war, you're saying, okay, either there was like a miscommunication or just like a coordination problem or someone was like not acting in their right mind, you know? Like famously, you can really trace like the mania of Hitler's behavior like and his like uppers use, you know. It's almost this whole sort of fascist movement being driven by the pharmaceuticals of the time and the lack of constraints around these. And similarly, I don't know if you have like an 88-year-old president, maybe you have a drug that can get him up and awake and out of debate, but what else is going to do this going to do to his judgment, you know? Maybe we don't know yet.
well, the way we're going, we're gonna find out soon enough. Um, I mean, but it's still to me this going back to Singapore a little bit. This is yet another example of uh how much of an outlier Singapore is from a governance standpoint. Like, why were they able to do all of this stuff? Like, why were they able to adopt the right policies? Why are they able to, despite having an authoritarian political system, still have property rights, and more or less the rule of law? Like, how are they able to buck the trend, so to speak? And the only answer I can come up with is just that Lee Kuan Yew in particular, but the leadership team in general were just cut from a different cloth. They were just that good. Like they were the outliers. Like they just happened to be like Singapore just happened to luck out where they just ended up with like an A plus, like S tier leadership team and the right point in history and rode that wave. And they're still riding it today, as far as I can tell.
And this is a bit of a it's a not frightening, but it does make you realize all the layers of bias and survivorship and the filtering of what you know, we're reading Singapore and its history as a case study. But as you said, luck out. If you have a few dozen Pacific nations and you are literally rolling the dice of who is going to end up in power for all of those, not one die because it's not a flat distribution, but say I think two or three. Once you have two or three dice, you end up with this kind of semi-normal distribution. So you're rolling three dice and summing the values for each of these countries, and one is just really, really high. And you go up, you go, hey, how'd you get such a high number? Right? Like there's no guarantee that they have actionable information on how to replicate that, which
Like,
he
yeah,
caveats at the beginning of the book.
what if the Communist Party had taken over in Singapore? I mean, not saying I don't know how likely that was, but that certainly was a probability greater than zero, probably greater than 5%, if not like much much higher, back in like the 50s and 60s. So I think part of it, I would say if I had to like identify the three main sources, it feels like number one, first and foremost, they had a great leadership team. And I think personalities and people ultimately can decide, have a huge impact on history. But it's not just never just about personalities though. So I think the second thing is that they happen to be on the right side of globalization. They were at a logistics hub, like a natural logistics hub between Asia and Europe and the Middle East, at the right point in history where containerization really took off and globalization and like kind of Pax Americana came into effect. And number three, they had, I think, the right level of external threats where they had Indonesia and Malaysia who were credibly dangerous to their survival, but not as dangerous as say having like Russia, like the USSR or Nazi Germany on your border. So you had just the right level of like threat where they were like incompetently, well, no offense to Malaysia and Indonesia, but compared to like say Singapore, incompetently run, but were sufficiently large that Singapore had to take them seriously. And I think having that sort of trifecta of great leadership, the right side of economic history, and just the right level of external threats to have group cohesion. Because without a common enemy, there's hard to have group cohesion. And so they had a common enemy, good leadership, and globalization. And to me, that's like the formula. Now, what percentage of each of those is accountable? It's hard to say, but if I had identified the three main ones, that would be that.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny what you say about an external threat that's just credible enough to provide some pressure. It almost reminds me of, like an atmosphere. A human being needs an atmosphere's worth of pressure on their body to keep them cohesive, but obviously you don't want to be crushed by it. He actually, it's very interesting his view of China through the century, and he says it's funny. He paints the time sort of just after the revolution as this almost like utopian naivete in the 50s and 60s. He talks about like I think he says you could leave something valuable in your hotel room and never worry about anyone touching it because they believed in the communist utopia so much. And then he paints the Cultural Revolution as this. I think in the West we like to paint it as like communist utopianism at its zenith, but he actually does the opposite. He says it was sort of this naked, self-serving banditry where people started using communist slogans and sort of hijacked the communist ideals for social climbing and tearing people down. And he speaks very negatively about it. But then he said something briefly to the extent of one of the things that really tamped down the Cultural Revolution mania is the threat of the Soviets encroaching on the Chinese border and getting more hegemonic or attempting to be more hegemonic in Southeast Asia as making the Chinese go, oh, it's getting real. And he also says in that sentence that that was that moment of shaping up after the Cultural Revolution where the Chinese decided they needed to apply maximum pressure to breaking down the Soviet Union, which I think is very interesting. We think of this like bipolar Cold War, but in that framing, it's like tripolar, or at the very least, China is like a close third, sort of putting the squeeze on the Soviets along with us. I guess if you look at it that way, it's very unsurprising who the two remaining factions ended up being. They were the monkey in the middle.
I wonder how much of like the U.S. understanding of the Russia-China relationship was analogizing like the US's role in NATO and Europe, where it really, I guess, like for the US and NATO, in Europe, it feels like the US truly is, or at least was, big brother calling the shots, looking out for little brothers. And we just, I think, seems like we projected that relationship on the USSR and communist China, when in fact they they didn't really have that type of close relationship, it seems.
No, I'm not an expert on the Warsaw Pact or communist China, so I don't want to speculate, but they
No,
were
that's what
certainly
a
very
podcast is for,
contentious.
Cairo.
What's that?
That's what a podcast is for.
Speculating
Couple of dudes
baselessly?
speculating on shit they don't understand.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, if you have opinions on this, dear listener, please comment. Incidentally, commenting does require a subscription to Futurist Letters, but I promise you it's worth it, and we will address whatever it is you bring up, if it is salient or entertaining. So, um, yes, I wonder something about, and maybe this is too cynical, too game theoristic, but I think about sort of the atomization, as they call it, of egalitarianism and blank slatism in liberal democracy, meaning every man or woman starts, uh, in at least in the public square, closer to a fresh start instead of this, say, like, monarchy with this complete heritability. I wonder if um, dynastic reign makes it easier in some cases to let go of power as you're becoming senile, because you see the successor more as an extension of you. You know, like I'm going to get my son to be king, and I'm going to slowly scale back my responsibilities. I don't know, or if you still just cling on to it just as much.
I mean, I'm no historian, but I have heard of many examples throughout history in multiple societies of the son like poisoning or murdering the father or the uncle, because the dad just won't die and won't give up power and is clearly incompetent. And so, y- I mean, maybe yes, in the sense that there's, albeit a violent one, still a way, like still like a succession plan where like, well, if Mitch McConnell is clearly too old, well, then Mitch McConnell's advisors will conspire with Mitch McConnell's son to poison him and then have the son take his Senate seat or something. Um, I don't know if that, I mean, clearly that wouldn't work in the United States. I'm not advocating for it, just to be clear. But yeah, I don't know if I agree.
No, no, I think that we've seen the downsides of dynasticism seem to outweigh the pros. It's got to be a bit, I don't know if scary is the right word, but you think about being someone like Lee Kuan Yew and realizing that you are like a third standard deviation hitter. I mean, you're just, for whatever reason, you're just the man. And you are trying so hard to find an heir, not in the genetic sense, but in the sense of someone who can continue your project. It's ironically, the more competent you are, the harder your job of finding someone who can do your kind of numbers. There's a reversion to the mean effect. If you're a terrible leader, it's got to be much less stressful to find an heir who might do better.
Well, I think that one of the things that made Lee Kuan Yew so good is because he actually did stress about finding someone who could do the job. Whereas I feel like a lesser leader probably wouldn't care. You know, like, what was it, Louis XV? Like après moi le déluge, like after me the flood. Like he's like, I don't give a fuck what happens to Louis XVI. And then look what I mean. French Revolution happened, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I guess that's one of the upshots of like democracy or electoral democracy is there's, if not it doesn't always produce and select like the best person to be in charge, but at least if someone's like a total lackluster dud with like zero charisma and zero competency, the odds of them rising to the top and becoming president or prime minister are pretty small. Like you can obviously get crappy presidents and crappy prime ministers. But even when you look at like the crappiest president or the crappiest prime minister of like UK or US, which are the countries I'm most familiar with, like they're well above average in terms of competency and intelligence, it seems like. Um,
Oh, for a human being or compared to like a monarch
for a
or
human being, for a human
mm,
being. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And would you say that is I guess would you say like the bottom quartile elected representative is much better than the bottom quartile dynastic heir?
Probably. Yeah, I feel
Probably,
like
I would guess, yeah.
there's a lot of I mean, when I think of aristocratic and monarchical Europe, like in the 18th and 19th century, I just picture a lot of inbred people slowly ceding power to this to like the state officials.
Well, and that's the other thing you have to think about in terms of governments with this heritable leader is how much are they really a figurehead for an oligarchy or a deep state, as it were, or a collection of nobles, you know? Even if they were a warrior king's descendant at one point, you know, if you have hundreds of years of incompetent sons, like at some point, the the oligarchs on a multi-generational scale are just gonna sideline them, I would assume, or try.
And
Yeah.
why wouldn't they, you know?
And why wouldn't they? Yeah.
Well, this actually is it too soon to start talking about other books we've read and liked? Or
I think that we can do that, and then we can touch a little more on final thoughts on Lee Kuan Yew before we go. So go
okay.
ahead.
I just happen to have a good segue mentioning oligarchy. I've been reading this really interesting book recently finished a couple weeks ago called Oligarchy. It's a study. I'm blanking on the author's name. I wish I could remember it. Uh,
Bernie Sanders.
what was that?
Bernie Sanders.
Well, it's by a political, like an actual like political scientist, and he studies oligarchy. He defines oligarchy in a specific way. It's like basically people with large material resources in society, and he has like a whole formal way of categorizing different types of oligarchies. You have warring oligarchies, so think like African warlords or dark ages in Europe, where it's just all the oligarchs are they're all directly armed, they're all fighting each other for scarce resources. And then you have something that you could think of as like a ruling oligarchy, where you have all these oligarchs who are quite powerful and have quite a lot of capacity for violence, but they're more or less getting along following rules. So think a mafia, or think Rome or Athens or Venice, where like like you look at like the history of Rome, the Roman Republic, like all those senators had their own fiefdoms, had their own, you know, capacity for violence. But when they came to Rome, they just agreed to like not use it against each other. There's a way, like the Roman Senate was basically a way for the Roman like oligarchs to jointly and mutually decide what to do. And then you have another type of oligarchy called sultanistic oligarchies, which don't necessarily have anything to do with like sultanates per se, but it's where you have one oligarch who has a much larger capacity for violence than the rest of the oligarchs. And so he keeps all the other oligarchs in line from fighting each other. So think like the absolute European monarchs, like in France or Prussia, or think
Why
Indonesia.
is oligarchy the best way to describe that last category versus, I don't know, hegemonic singular rule? Like, isn't he sort of like the Hobbesian Leviathan if he's singularly able to control the occurrence of violence?
So you can think of like sultanistic oligarchy is also maybe a comparison you can make is like Russia under Putin versus perhaps Russia under Stalin. Like under Stalin, there were no oligarchs. Like no one really had material resources. It was all belonged to the state. But fast forward, I don't know, 80 years, Putin's like the wealthiest of all the oligarchs and he has the highest coercive capacity. But like every oligarch there has their own source of wealth, their own source of coercive capacity and violence.
So,
Um,
would you say that versus an absolute dictatorship in a what did you say,
Sultanistic oligarchy.
sultanistic oligarchy? Theoretically, with their combined force, all the minor oligarchs could like 51% attack the big guy, but they
Probably.
have some internal divisions preventing them from doing that.
Yeah, it might even like be require less than all of them. You know, it could be. And usually, when you see like a sultanistic oligarch lose power, it's sometimes it'll be framed like a popular resistance movement, like think the Arab Spring in Egypt. When really what's happening behind the scene is the rest of the oligarchs, for some reason, feel like this guy isn't doing a good job being sultan anymore. And they're like, we got to pick another guy to be in charge. Because
That
they
was
all
something.
recognize need someone to be at the top to keep them all from fighting each other, you know. But they just, you know, then it's just like a power struggle of like who gets to be sit on the hot seat, as it were.
Someone whose opinion I very respect, who's very measured and observant, said in her observance of Hollywood from 2017 to 23 that there's definitely sort of a clearing out of a lot of people, cancellations or careers ended, as it were. And she had this sort of working theory that for a certain amount of those people, putting aside any matter of the morality of what they did, there was, as you said, this sort of uh, unseen oligarchic interest in um, flushing that person, right? And there's sort of like it was this popular outrage plus the consent of the rival oligarchs, basically saying this guy's got to go. And she was basically contrasting it to other times where someone also has allegations or something like that, but there is no inter oligarchic will to flush the person. And so you see this much, much, much more muted effort to try and depose.
Well, it's like, you know, how many people that were huge box office draws and were making tons of money, either as like a producer, a director, or a leading actor. How many of them got canceled
Yeah.
versus the
I mean,
ones that
it's
were like
it's
past?
really a lot of people either who are past their prime or um the system felt that they could be replaced. I mean, here's the thing. The institution of Tom Cruise, you can't swap out Tom Cruise. In fact, it's funny. Speaking of people who are trying to pick an heir, Tom Cruise is putting a lot of energy into Glenn Powell, right? And
Interesting.
it's because he has this very far-sighted vision, not just of Tom Cruise the institution, but of like Hollywood the institution. And he sees like the heroic male movie star as one of these like load-bearing uh pieces of the Hollywood that he believes in continuing, right? So he's going, okay, I can't do this forever. I'm gonna pick a guy. Funny enough, it's him and Denzel Washington who both sort of picked up Glenn Powell and are pushing him. But
Interesting.
yeah, Denzel was like really interested in sort of making Glenn Powell his successor, which is funny, but people work in
There's
funny ways.
that other guy who is in Gladiator 2. I've seen in a few roles. He seems to have what's his name?
Oh, I didn't see Gladiator
Pedro
2.
Pascal.
Pedro Pascal is definitely on the up. Yeah, I have a friend who works with him. I guess he's a nice guy.
Seems nice. Yeah. I mean, who knows? Anyway, the last form of oligarchy, the missing one is like the one that America and Singapore fall into, which is called a civil oligarchy, where in a warring oligarchy, there's no rules that constrain oligarchs from like killing each other. In like a ruling oligarchy, there's like rules, and those rules are enforced by like a social consensus. Which sounds a little bit like how Hollywood might be or was. Then you have a sultanistic oligarchy where you have like King Louis or Suharto or Putin. enforcing the rules, keeping the oligarchs from killing each other and taking each other's stuff. In the civil oligarchy, you have the state who enforces the rules and has a more or less independent judicial system. And independent doesn't necessarily mean like independent for people like you and me going up against the state or going up against an oligarch. It's independent in the sense that like if two oligarchs don't agree, they can rely on the courts to adjudicate and not pick a side between oligarchic factions. So like Singapore, for example, like if you say bad things about the PAP, they ain't give you a whole lot of judicial independence.
PAP being the People's Action Party, which is Lee Kuan Yew's party, the ruling party of Singapore.
Precisely. But if you're like, I don't know, if you're, if you're like Nvidia and you have a dispute with Apple in some Singapore plant, just hypothetically, like you can rely on the Singaporean judicial system adjudicating your dispute. And so the United States, even though we're a democracy, in many ways we're still an oligarchy and always have been. And when you rethink like the US Constitution is less about empowering the people and more about like creating a framework for oligarchs to coexist, it makes a lot more sense. And so in a way, like the rise of Donald Trump, in some ways it's a pretty big transition where we're relying less on the state and more on like a sultan in the form of Trump, like adjudicating oligarchic disputes.
I don't think that you could say he rises to the level of the sultanistic. I would say that he is acting like he is, but in fact, it's very much an open game because the ability to ram through and remain top dog on the other side of a national election is not guaranteed. I mean, I think that Republicans were acting like it was after um, the election, the 2020 election, where they were saying, "Oh, Democrats control the vote rigging, so they are effectively the monostate." And then, I mean, I feel like the election of Trump in 24 sort of, in theory, puts cold water on that um, idea of Democrats controlling the national elections. But
Yeah, they're
the point is,
really not good at it if they are.
um, I think we're seeing. Not to sound dramatic, I'm really trying to talk about this analytically. In sort of the ignoring of court decisions and disdaining of court decisions and this broader viewing of Ninth Circuit decisions, broader federal decisions as being unjust or invalid. There was recently this exchange between Rand Paul and JD Vance on Twitter where I don't know if you saw this, Kenny, but we blew up. So we blew up a drug smuggling boat with a Hellfire missile, I believe. Yeah, with like 11 people on it. And I've got Coast Guard buddies. I've learned a lot about these boats. I personally do believe it was a drug smuggling boat, although of course the evidence is vaporized. But anyway, we blew up 11 people in international waters with this missile, right? And JD Vance just had this whole thing which you can do an interesting biographical reading of, considering his family history with drug abuse. But he was basically saying if you're bringing drugs into the United States, that's basically a violent act against Americans, and so we have every right to blow you up. And Rand Paul said, "No, these people need due process. Haven't you read To Kill a Mockingbird?" And everyone started making fun of him for I don't know, being a nerd. But like, the fact that it's basically just like, oh yeah, and Vance said something like, I don't give a shit. I think that was his response, right? And I think the response to like basically like the civic code, both de jure and like normative, as like I don't give a shit, that's like such a good encapsulation of the transition away from the civic oligarchy toward whatever it is the Trump people are trying to do.
I Building off what you said, been feeling this myself, where it felt like he's like, why are they able to just do things and like, close down the USAID department, and whether you're for or against, the USAID department, the fact that it was constitutionally mandated and they're able to just shut it down, like 10 years ago, like if Obama tried to do that, can you imagine like the uproar?
I want to dig into that because everyone says that, including Obama. But I mean, what if Obama had basically just bulldozed through court orders? What would actually have happened?
I mean, I think that's part I think there's a couple of things. I think there's a couple of things that are qualitatively different now versus then. One of the things is like there is legitimate independent sources of power from the presidency in Congress. Like a lot of the senators and House representative people had their own very strong power base and their own interests that they could actually truly thwart what was going on. Or if Obama did something that they didn't like, I think both on the Democrat side and the Republican side, if he tried to do something they didn't like, they had like the actual power resources to thwart his agenda. Whereas
Like
on
through
the
a congressional order?
what was that?
Through a congressional order?
I think this is where believe it to be true, but don't really have like the means of proving it to be true. Where I think it was probably more like under behind the scenes, like it wouldn't be a congressional order per se. There would just be like bad things would start happening, and it would be unexplainable and untraceable back to them. But like
Sort of a
Obama
deep
would know,
state. Okay. I,
kind of
I
like
I don't know if I agree because I think we spend a lot of time being afraid of walls that are just norms or these ideas of these apocalyptic consequences that, so much of the Cold War hinged on this idea of Russia as basically this superpower on a par with the US. And as we can see, they can't even invade Ukraine. I mean, talk about a myth busting as fast as this complete Russian front collapse when they were trying to push on Kiev. Um, Similarly, you look at the last time somebody really tried to ignore the Supreme Court, which I think was probably the Trail of Tears, right, with Andrew Jackson. Nothing happened. Not only did he just do it, there were no repercussions. He was not arrested. He did not face legal penalties. Um, and his ideology didn't even really face electoral penalties. So it to me makes this idea of like the Supreme Court as a power, it feels like a complete paper tiger to me.
I mean, you might be right. I had this realization the other day where okay, so Donald Trump's approval ratings are what, 40%?
45-ish%.
Let's just say
But
40.
they have been 45% for years. They will be 45%. There could be videos of him literally hanging out with Satan coming out in 4K and he would be at 45%.
I mean, there's videos of him hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein in his approval
Yeah,
rating.
and there you go. He's at 45%.
Uh, anyway, so it's 45%, right? Not great. It's not high, but it's not super low. You compare the approval ratings of Trump to any other American political institution, say Congress, Senate, House, like Supreme Court, or even different like departments within the executive branch. All of those are like lucky if they clear 20%, you know? Last I checked, or maybe 30%, but they're like substantially lower. Donald Trump, even though he is vehemently hated and opposed by a large number of people in our country, he is the most well liked and most like well trusted political institution right now.
Are you sure? What is the approval rating of the Supreme Court?
I don't know. Let's find
I
out.
don't know. I think it's worth looking up just for the sake of this argument. I would be very curious to know. Historically, they've been the highest.
All right. So the Supreme Court approval rating is at 48%, favorable, 50%
Okay.
favorable. So
So that to
basically,
me
it's
sounds
doing
like,
as
and
bad as.
do you have a partisan split on that?
Yeah, so it's 70% favorable among Republicans and
Okay.
26% favorable among Democrats right
So
now.
the perception now with the balance of the court is that it's essentially an arm of Trumpism, which I don't think is true, as we've seen with them stymieing him a lot. I think the court is much more committed to this idea of democratic republicanism than Trump, but at the very least, that seems to be the broad perception.
I think that the Supreme Court's interests are. I think Trump's interests are pretty narrow. I think Trump's interests are Trump, and then if there's a long tail of other things he cares about. Whereas I think the Supreme Court has maybe a broader selection of things it values.
I hate to say this, but I think I disagree. I mean, obviously, he's an egoist in the sense that all human beings are egoists. They care about their own. They want what they like to exist and happen more. But I would say his likes and desires include something that he considers his vision of a a prosperous future for the United States. Like I really do think he has an internal model of what he considers to be a good future for the United States that he thinks he's directionally working toward.
What do you think is in that model? Like,
Well,
what are the
we
parts of that model that are somewhat immutable?
we know he thinks that a trade deficit represents uh, a leeching of the lifeblood of the country. That he has this very mercantilist view where we need to be an exporter of things. We know that he really doesn't like war. I would say Trump probably has the highest gut level aversion to war of maybe any president we've had in decades, maybe since Carter. I mean, he had some like truth post a year or two ago where he said like, "I just want the world to stop killing itself," regarding like his inability to sort of shore up civil wars and regional conflicts. And I mean, his State Department has brokered truces in like a dozen regional conflicts or something like that. So I do think he legitimately does not like war. Um, I don't know. I unfortunately I don't think he has the like capacity of reflectiveness needed to build a model like Beyond Vibes, really. Like that's why it's like 80-90% vibes. And I think that it's like his insecurities in the driver's seat. So anyone who doesn't like him or speaks ill of him, like, that's a threat, like at this very like childlike ego level. And then he makes the leap from that into ergo, whatever they like must be bad for the country. So I think a lot of his vision of the country is like negatively polarized against people who criticize him and what they want.
I mean,
That's my armchair psychoanalysis.
I think that makes sense. I think what's tricky to me about interpreting and understanding Trump is I think more than anything, he's a true master at misdirection on the grand stage. I think he's very much like a magician or a confidence man in the sense that like he'll make a big motion over here and get you to look at the big motion when really like behind his back he's doing some sleight of hand.
Yeah, he's one of the most eloquent figures in like the history of the English language, which is funny because his speech is so crass, but he's coined as many phrases as Shakespeare easily, phrases that will stay with us forever. I mean, I
It's
feel
all
him in my
computer.
speech. He's like a
What
part
is
of
this?
all of us now. Yeah, many such cases.
I mean, I think like he it's hard to know what he actually wants because he's so good at like misdirecting you to think he wants X when really he never cared about X. He just wanted you to focus on X so that he could, use that as leverage to get Y. Um, And I think it makes it tough to really know what he wants. And I think that's the art of the deal, baby. Um,
Not to get too deep, but I think you could probably argue that anyone who has a secular worldview never knows what they want, or at least they don't have this like guiding anchor in their religious cosmology. I don't know. Like I don't know. I think we've probably had a lot of irreligious presidents, but he's fairly obviously not religious. And I just wonder what his answers are to the big questions, you know? What's it all for?
I mean, he wrote a letter to Epstein that seemed to outline his philosophy in a way that
Gaining enough power to engage in illicit pleasures. Talk about Rome. I mean, yeah, this is, and perhaps that's what's left in the absence of religion, right? A hedonic treadmill, a descent into, I don't know. I hope not.
I read a quote somewhere. It was a Substack essay quoting someone else, and so now you're hearing this quote third hand. But the gist of it was that for people that are secular, like the only true like transcendental thing that they can believe in is the future. And so I think you, on the one hand, if you're secular, you can descend into straight up hedonism. On the other hand, these aren't mutually exclusive. You can overly fixate on some future paradise, some future utopia. And I feel like that's where certain, if not like all of Silicon Valley, like certainly like a decent number of influential players in Silicon Valley seem to have that like techno futurist utopian designs.
And ends justify the means. That's the danger with being a utopian, is if you're a utopian, you're taking in your, it's like, I guess put it this way. You know how a VC is willing to spend a lot of money on a startup because there is a tail chance of this incalculably good upside as far as becoming the next Uber? A utopian is like that with radicalism, right? Like they see at least a tail chance, if not an inevitability, of a future that is so good that you're in the black on doing pretty much anything to bring it about, right? Like that's a very dangerous person because their rational utilitarian calculus can lead them to very, very, very serious, dire deeds for the sake of utopia. Yeah, I think it's a balance of two axes. One is the ego of the self within the body versus a broader sense of self that incorporates either your family or the human race or Earth and all its life, or perhaps the whole universe. Obviously, someone who is too far on one or the other sliding scale of that is a bit lost, right? And the other one is low versus high time preference, right? The balance of seeking good outcomes in the immediate versus in the long term. And again, there's sort of a middle path there. So
I think one thing that has, I feel like, helped me try to at least help me feel like I'm being more grounded is like, I think it's that Gandhi quote of "Be the change you want to see in the world." And I don't know if that's not universally always going to be the case. You can't always live your life that way, and it's not necessarily gonna fix everything. However, if there's some ideal, some future ideal that I want, or some future state I want to get to, but I'm living my life in a way that's like goes against like the value system I'm applying under the future, then I'm probably not really, my heart's not really in the right place. Uh, like, if I want like the future to be, I don't know, let's say I have less plastic pollution in the ocean, but I'm just using tons of reusable plastic. Like I'm ordering all this fast fashion clothes littered with microplastics. Again, no judgment being cast on people that do fast fashion, but like if this is really important to me and I am ordering fast fashion, like I'm kind of living a contradiction.
I don't
So
know. I think I disagree.
huh?
I think I disagree. I think that it's okay to have a directional ideal for society, um, and yet participate in the mode of the day, even in a way that is in contradiction to what you would want. Or, I don't know, it's a difficult question, right? Like, should you personally engage in something that you would ban? The issue is this, you know, it all gets mixed together and spat back out through a global economy. You use energy that is in part fueled by coal, even if you don't think we should have coal plants running. That doesn't mean you can't use energy, and it's some small part of the grid that's powering it that changes based on the time of day. It's not feasible to do the research to figure out exactly when your grid is and isn't being powered by a coal plant, you know? Um, I don't know. I think there's honor in living as like a modal person according to the institution that you're in, and then trying to guide the institution toward your ideal state, understanding that you are just one agent in a large uh agreement, a moral agreement.
I think I agree. You don't want to like over apply this rule willy nilly, and to some extent, we're enmeshed in a system, and we don't really have a choice but to participate in the system because if we all go and live in the woods, there's not enough woods to support everyone, and we're all going to die. And I think that's definitely not an outcome that I want. I think I think it's still important to recognize the hypocrisy that you're living. I think all of us are living in a hypocrisy in that, like, our values probably in the system we're living in are not, uh, perfectly matched, and I think it's important to recognize where they are in tension, and for things that we do, the parts of our lives that we kinda do have a choice and do have some control over to try and make that part, more or less in accordance with, like, a future state that we wanna get to. So, like, in the fast fashion example, it's like, okay, like, true, the laptop that I'm using right now is being powered by a coal plant. I don't like that, but I'm not gonna stop using power. That's just not an option. Like, I don't have to buy, a disposable, like, fashion outfit. And for me, it's not a very big sacrifice 'cause I don't fucking really.
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, Kenny, you end up starting with your aesthetic preferences and then like,
Well, they definitely
post
are, like,
facto
when
building
I see plastic on the beach, I try to
morals
pick
around
it up,
this.
right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is it gonna have a huge impact on, like, Pacific Garbage Patch? No. I mean, it's like less than a rounding error of a rounding error, but I just try to
But
live.
it's about living with yourself to some degree. And I think in my eyes, that's the big distinction, right? It's like, can you believe that we should be moving toward a vegan or a lab grown meat society and yet still eat meat? I think to me, the answer to this question is like, does it make you feel badly about yourself, right? Like if you are eating meat, are you just sitting there racked with the guilt and the pain of this animal and what you've done? Like you need to be the person that you can go to sleep and wake up with every day, you know? So it's like, but I also think you can like rationalize and abstract away, well, okay, I need to eat meat for this or that reason. I'm a performance athlete, etc.
Yeah, I agree. I think when it comes to the utopians of the world, I think if there's a utopia that they're like the fundamentalist, very ideological utopians out there, there's a utopia they want to get to, but it involves like doing horrific acts that would go against that utopia. I feel like that's a red flag.
Literally a red flag. I think that when you have a utopian movement and the utopians say, "Hey man, we're going to create the perfect society and we just need to do a bunch of horrible stuff to get there." Your filtering effect is to get a lot of people who just kind of want an excuse to do horrible stuff. going, yeah, man. I mean, this is sort of like who's signing up for the Red Guard, who's signing up for the Gestapo, it's like if you have some certain federal law enforcement organization that becomes famous for abuses, I think you're going to see a shift in the character of people who sign up to be agents of that organization post abuse narrative because, well,
Sounds
they
li-
kind of know what they're getting into.
I wish I could draw an analog to what you said to what's happening today, but I can't. I can't think of anything that would correspond to that right now.
It's kind of like I think if you were to put out an ad in the paper in the 50s and say, hey, we're looking for students who want to play prisoners or guards for an experiment at Stanford, versus if you did that today, you'd get like a very different class of people submitting today just because of this cultural understanding of what that means, and it's kind of along those lines.
Oh, absolutely.
I
And
don't
I
know.
think, well, what other books are you interested in, Cairo, or have you read that you're?
Books, we'll get to books, but I have a question that I want to ask because I can see that when we talk about Singapore, we end up talking about America. And what I want to know is how do we get a Lee Kuan Yew? And do we even want one? I mean, term limits since Roosevelt have become something of a sacred belief. Do we even want a Lee Kuan Yew? Like, do we want to do something that would be considered backsliding? I don't know.
Well, I think before we can answer that question, I have another question that we should consider before we answer that one, which is what would a Lee Kuan Yew even look like in America? Because,
In a giant federal
yeah,
republic,
like, do
you
we
know,
want like a Lee Kuan Yew like in charge of the federal government and give him what he needs to do what he wants to do, or do we want like a more of a federated system where we don't really have a federal government and we have like Lee Kuan Yews in every state or city state?
you know, it's funny. You can think of a federal system as a type of oligarchy where you have 50 oligarchs and they have to coordinate on how much to leave each other alone versus oppress each other, right? And I don't know, you kind of did in your book, did they ever talk about the idea of oligarchs being cut into blocks or compressed down to two factions just by game theory?
No, that was one of the omissions in the book, in my opinion, is talked. I think he made some very compelling points about how material wealth is the decisive difference between an oligarch versus other types of elites. For example, like a mega
Like college
pastor.
professors?
Yeah, college
Oh,
professors,
pastors.
pastors, or bureaucrats have sources of power that are not about how much money they have, but those sources don't just auto renew and compound the way material wealth does.
So
Um,
Martin Luther, for example, was certainly an elite influentially, but not an oligarch.
Correct.
Mm.
And then, like, Henry Kissinger was an elite, extremely powerful man, not an oligarch. Bill Gates, oligarch. Um,
Crassus, oligarch.
Caesar, oligarch,
Yes.
but also more than an oligarch. Um,
Yeah, it's funny. Wealth, in a way, it becomes a semantic question. Like, if you are a cardinal of the Catholic Church, in a way you have no wealth, and in a way you have the wealth of the Catholic Church, depending on your ability to convince the Pope, right? If you are a rogue general, your wealth, in a sense, is your ability to convince fighting men to fight for you. And if they are in tank battalions, then how many you can convince directly translates into how many tanks you own in that moment that you rebel. In a way, maybe you don't even know your wealth until you oppose the institution, and then you find out.
Well, it was like that rogue warlord in the Ukraine war. I can't remember his name, but the Wagner guy. He was an
Yeah,
oligarch in the sense that he was had a source of wealth. You know, he flew in private jets,
yeah.
but he was more
Well,
than
he took his last flight in a private jet. Yeah,
but he was more than just like he's more than just an oligarch with money. He was also a general or a
yeah.
generalissimo, I guess. I don't know what the you know, I'm not sure how much of a military mind he was, but he was certainly a man
I
who
think
commanded
yeah.
troops and had
So
their
this is a good
loyalty
question,
to
but
this.
I want to let you finish what you were saying about oligarchy, and then I'll circle back.
That's it. Yeah.
Well, what I wanted to say, because this Bill Gates thing is interesting. Say Bill Gates basically became an enemy of the state. Say that he, like crossing the Rubicon or like Prigozhin, decided unequivocally, I am an enemy of the United States and I'm going to try and take it down, right? I don't know how much wealth he could actually muster. I mean, his stocks, his money is tied up in the institution in a way that it would be immediately taken from him. I think the more prep time he had, probably the more he could convert his wealth into harder means. But it's like, if you are in the IRS and you see that like Bill Gates is buying military surplus, like at what point, I don't know how far he could get, I guess is my question, even with billions of dollars.
I mean, this the state, for all its flaws and drawbacks, is inordinately more powerful than any individual oligarch in the United States. And I
And
think
does
this
a
is true
good
of every
job keeping
country,
the
but
monopoly on violence.
yeah, I I think it gets more interesting when maybe think about like Elon Musk. I still think if he wanted to take down the state, it wouldn't go well for him. However, he does have more or less unilateral control over Starlink. And that's an important piece of real infrastructure that the US government relies on. Um, so he'd have a little bit more coercive power, but for how long would he be able to control Starlink? How long until you know, the US military like just storms the uh SpaceX campus in California or Texas and takes it over and says, "All right, turn it back on."
I think for better or worse, we don't know the answer to this question until it happens because you have in a way the distributed, like, what do you call it? Almost like block verification in a blockchain of the United States is basically like the military all over the country with tanks, Humvees, aircraft, bombs, ordnance, sitting around on their bases, receiving orders and going, is this a valid order or not? Right? Like that's like they're like error checking the government. And in theory, if someone tries to uh, you know, do some sort of hostile action and corrupt the government, like the correct government will tell the military, stop this person, right? And like, so like we don't know what will happen in a situation where there are conflicting martial orders that like you can't get a super majority of the military to agree on, like which is valid. I hope that I don't live to see that, even though it would be interesting, it would probably also suck.
Yeah, it's unclear. It's unclear how easily or effectively you could implement a coup in the United States because there's so many different independent sources of power outside of Washington D.C.
I also fear we are really being so bimodally polarized. I fear that anything that did look like a coup would really cleave pretty much 50-50, where both sides were calling the other side the coup and calling themselves the legitimate continuance. I think it was Obama, or it might have actually been I think it was Obama, talking about how the most vulnerable point in any small democracy is the transfer of power. Like, you really need everyone to agree on who the next leader is. To me, you've already seen little bits of this. In 2000, with people saying that Gore was the actual president, but it was all hot air. Trump saying he was actually the president in 2020, and it was mostly hot air with a small amount of storming the Capitol. It's like we're almost getting these foreshocks of how it's going to go, and one day it won't just be hot air, right? And what happens when there are two guys saying I'm president one day? I
I
don't know.
don't know.
Or a guy and a woman, or a guy and a they them.
Getting back to the Lee Kuan Yew question,
Yeah.
would we want Lee Kuan Yew, that kind of guy, in charge of the U.S.? And if so, how much control and power would we want to give him? I don't know.
I mean, I'm kind of tempted to say yes, because I think there are so many big things on the table that need a strong hand to fix. I've been thinking about, I feel like this dedication to local input, to localism, to community input, to environmental regulation and zoning has sort of frozen American infrastructure in amber starting in the early
Well,
70s.
certainly if you're living in Los Angeles, it feels that way.
Yeah. Maybe Los Angeles just needs a Lee Kuan Yew. I think I'd settle for that.
I'll,
He doesn't need to be the king of Montana, too.
I'll
In
tell
fact,
you
he
what.
famously talks about not, having no experience controlling the hinterland, as he calls it. So maybe that would be more his speed.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I would
Yeah.
be I would be almost certainly in favor if we had like the avatar of Lee Kuan Yew in charge of Los Angeles, and everyone's like, let's give this guy like more or less unilateral control over what this city does over the next 5 years and see what happens. That's a social experiment I would want to run. I feel like LA has a ton of potential, um, as a city, as an urban area that like is a little bit down on its luck right now. It's been highly mismanaged, been knocked down by a natural disaster or two, but like still has a lot of the things that made LA really great and successful in the 20th century. Like I think still apply. They just
So
need.
he's out there. And I think we just do it in three steps. First, we find our Lee Kuan Yew. Second, we get him into office. And third, we break down the democratic guardrails and basically, you know, install him for decades. And
You
then
sound
we go
just
from
like
there.
Pete Steele talking about JD Vance.
Yeah, but the difference is that's JD Vance.
he's no he's no Lee Kuan Yew.
Come on, I maybe I should couch my words a little more, but I'm not the biggest fan. Okay. Well, I think that if we haven't scared off two-thirds of our listenership with this episode, then thanks for sticking with us, guys. We should talk about our next book club episode, which I'm sure will also be exciting. Do you want to plug the book so the readers can pick it up?
Absolutely. Well, speaking of, tech utopians and the technological singularity, there's this interesting book I've read recently in the last year or so called Accelerando. It's written in three parts. The first part looks a lot like a modern day cyberpunk. And then it carries on with exponential technological change throughout the 21st century. So takes place over roughly 100 years of human history. And by the end of the first part, it's starting to look, I think it was written in like the late 90s, early 2000s, and it starts to look a little bit like foreshadowing like the Chat GPT revolution, but goes even further than that. It starts to look a little bit like very plausible, but also starts to feel a little different and uncomfortable. And then the exponential change just keeps going. And by the end of the third book, you're almost in an unrecognizable state, but you every step of the way, it feels like a logical transition.
So the
And
question is, what if line kept going up?
yeah, and it exactly. And to me, it was one of the it was the first book I've ever read that I felt like really took that, like a sci-fi book that really took the tech singularity seriously. I think the guy who wrote it is like a chemist or something. Like he's like had like a PhD in chemistry or whatever. So he's like blanking on his name. So he takes like the actual science and engineering somewhat seriously. And I feel like a lot of sci-fi books you read are using like the science and the science in service of the fiction. Explore characters or explore human values. Whereas this is more
And
like
tweaking the
using
science wherever it needs to serve the fiction.
yeah. And whereas this one is like using fiction as a way to bring out the science, if that makes sense. And I
Yeah,
think
I'm reminded a little of like Andy Weir, doing the Martian, having this very strong commitment to like space mechanics. I'm excited to read it. Please, listeners, do read along. We would love to have you, and we promise a good discussion in about 1 month's time. So that would be basically the middle of October. You can expect that. Kenny, one more time, the book and the author.
Accelerando. Let me look at the author.
Yeah, people need this. Accelerando.
Accelerando
Sounds vaguely
novel by
like
Charles
Latin.
Strauss. Sorry, Accelerando, Charles Strauss. It's about 400 pages shorter than the Lee Kuan Yew book.
Very cool. We like a
Easier to-
brisk book. Okay, well, I think this fits very nicely with our theme for the journal and the show, which is that the future begins in our imagination. So thank you, Kenny, for picking the book. I'm excited to read it. If you, listener, now or in the future, read or have read all or some of From Third World to First, The Singapore Story by Lee Kuan Yew, we can maybe even treat the comment section of this episode as a little bit of a discussion section. So please feel free to leave your own takes. I would be very happy to hear it. Um, we always do appreciate your listenership. If you would like to sponsor the show, this is where your sponsor message will go. And this has been a nice little hour and change. So we're going to leave you, and we will see you next week with a guest as we continue our fall uh, series of episodes. So, Kenny, thanks for doing this with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's a lot of fun, and yes, folks, we'll see you next time.